now?
I can see that. Yep.
Wonderful. So we'll just start the slideshow from beginning. So thank you very much, Julie, for asking me to talk about my favourite subject, which is the Liddiards. What I'm going to do is take you on my journey, take you through the roadblocks and the many twists and turns that we have through this study over the last 30 odd years. I look upon this as my thesis, and it really is my second job. I'm just a custodian of this of all the information that we've gathered over the years. It's not just me, it's been the Liddiard One Name Study has been started from about 1880. I'm very lucky to be the recipient of previous One Name Studies, which we'll touch on a little bit later. Now, why did I start? It was certainly, well, we thought it was a rare name in Australia, which it was. My family could not tell me where the name come from. So it kind of was, would I call it an accidental one name study? The only family that they were able to tell me, well, what they wanted to tell me, I should say inverted commas, was from myself, my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather. But when I started asking questions as a teenager, because I was always interested in history, nobody could even tell me when my great-great-grandfather was born. Now, looking back as an adult, I think it was because there was, shall we say, just a few mishaps in the family. Namely, great-great-granny was a bigamist, and I don't think they wanted me turning up that information. So everything was quite vague when I started asking questions of my family. But I didn't only inherit the Liddiard nose, I also inherited that dogged determination to find out where our family came from. So the family legends and those things that they did tell me was, always spell our name as Liddiard. There is millions in Chancery in the UK. So, hey, they did know we were from the UK. As a Liddiard married a servant and she spelt the name incorrectly, therefore the other side of the family received that money. We owned the Salisbury Plains at one time. Well, obviously they knew we were from Wiltshire, and we owned Liddiard House, and it was taken from us. And someone stole the family Bible. We'll come back to those family legends right at the end, and I'll let you know what I found out about each of those legends. So where did our name originate? The first thing I did was actually run to the State Library in Sydney, and I actually had a look to see where it was, which gave me a clue that we were an Old English name, and through a few others that possibly we were actually a name from in and around Wiltshire. And we can see here from another meaning of the name, it does start listing those many variants that the name has or the family has. So I soon discovered when I went back after many years of research, researching in Australia at that time was not easy. There was no Ancestry, there was no Find My Past. What we had was the St Catherine's indexes, which were only available either at the State Library in Sydney or at the Society of Australian Genealogy. And I've spent many, many, many years going through those indexes, collecting all of the Liddiards in the hope that I would actually find my 3 times great-grandfather. I eventually did through the help of the LDS's IGI index, and that told me that we were originally from a little town in Wiltshire called Aldbourne. Now today that village is considered the home of the Liddiards. Many of the trees from the Liddiards all around the world can, if they go back far enough, we can actually show that they are from that little village in England. There's many and varied ways of spelling the name, as I mentioned. There's 27 of them. Between 1637 and 1925, there are actually 920 instances of the surname in the parish records of Aldbourne. So literally there was a Liddiard at every corner. Now from this particular village, we've managed to flourish, and we've come to every corner of the world. Some of the other places that we were originally from the 1600s, we don't seem to have flourished as much as we have from Aldbourne. Unfortunately, though, today, there is only one person who was born a Liddiard that is still living there. So they get quite excited when I visit because we've actually got two in the village. As you can see, the population of Aldbourne, which also helps us explain the variants a little later on. It was quite a small village. However, 925 of them are in the parish registers, and that doesn't count the many nonconformists there was from that particular village either. In 1851, the population of Aldbourne was 1556. Of those that I've managed to pull out of the 1851 census, which I have done from the whole country, 7.5% said they were from there. That's quite a large percentage. If we go back even further in time, I estimate that 20% of that village population was a Liddiard. So again, there was one on every corner, and we held many of the varied jobs in the village as well. Also too, because there was such a small village, I would hate to do an autosomal DNA of the village of Aldbourne, because as you can see, there's many Liddiards married into nearly every single family that there was there. This one's a prime example. There's also many examples of Liddiards marrying Liddiards in that particular village as well. My first roadblock has always been to get back any further. We know the Liddiards in Australia. We knew them from New Zealand. Okay, was this our hometown? And how could I prove if it was or wasn't? But it throws up many interesting issues if you actually do a forensic look into the parish records of Aldbourne. Number one, the early parish records are missing. Even after 1637, there are many burials that we cannot see any baptisms for. If you look in the history of the town, you'll see that it was a hotbed of many nonconformists. So there are those very, very, very early nonconformist records are missing too. What I also found was prior to about 1660, there wasn't that many burials of our name. In the early parts, there certainly wasn't many wills that I could actually go through from that particular village. So I had to ask myself why. Well, my first question was answered in the later parish register book when there's a note there to say that the earlier register had been removed at the time of the Civil War or the Revolution to St. Omer's in France. Now, my research into that was the vicar at the time was actually on the wrong side of the Civil War. So he scarpered, and the legend has it that he took the early parish registers with him. Whether or not that's true, because there's also another rumour that it was taken to prove a legitimacy claim, we'll never know, I suppose. But the analysis of the records indicate that Aldbourne was not our original home. It appears there were around 4 Liddiards that moved to Aldbourne from somewhere else. So where were they from? So that meant I had to look further afield than that particular little village. What I found was if I actually did a 30-mile radius around that particular village, I would find all the very early Liddiards, namely in about the really early ones was namely in the first 4 circles. So yes, we are a locational name, but to Aldbourne wasn't our first port of call in Wiltshire. Only 6 miles from Aldbourne, we see another load of Liddiards appearing in a little village about 3 or 4 miles down the road, 6 miles down the road, of Aldbourne St Andrew in the little hamlet of Rocklea. We even appear in the earliest parish records there from 1538. What I found was we were middle-class gentry and we were owned and credited building some of the manors in the area. We actually built Rocklea Manor. We owned Poulton House. We actually built Poulton House. And a lot of the big land holdings we actually owned in that particular area. We also owned the tithes and chancel of the Church of Aldbourne St Andrew, which has proved to be very problematic in the later years. My next question was, were these two lines related? That's what I tried to find out, which took me many years, but we did find the answer. In about 1999, I actually visited England, and I decided to look at what supposedly was some papers in the Society of Genealogy in London. There was one box with portions of an early Liddiard One Name Study, which of course piqued my interest. This particular writer was from the Aldbourne Rockley line, which I previously mentioned. I had to find the descendant and find out if that study still existed. It wasn't until 2010, through researching that particular line, going backwards and forwards to finally bringing it down to today, and I found there was a male descendant of this line. And I wanted to know who had the study and or did it still exist? So I wrote and emailed him and I waited. Finally, in 2013, I got an email out of the blue, and it just so happened to correspond with one of my tri-yearly trips to the UK. So I got to meet him, and those boxes were in his attic. This particular early One Name Study was completed by 3 generations of his family from 1880 through to the 1960s. I have spent many, many, many hours in the attic and bringing those boxes down, imaging all that. It is unfortunately that the descendant from my line and his line is not interested. So hopefully we can actually put that One Name Study either in the Society of Genealogies in London or in the Wiltshire Archives Office. What I did find was, which has been a truly, truly useful tool to the Liddiard study, was that line can be proven with an unbroken line from 1453 to today. Now that can be proved through wills, through land indentures and manorial records. When people say follow the money, it's so true. You can actually see the line of descent clearly from the manorial records there. Since that time, I have been walking in their footsteps, proving their research. And I have to say their sources were impeccably recorded, which makes it very, very easy to actually follow in the footsteps from 1880. The other really good thing about that was some of the Somerset wills, which we all know that were unfortunately destroyed, I understand, in World War II. That was looked at in the early 1900s by William Bedford Liddiard, who was the first writer of this particular study. He has transcribed a lot of those wills and taken the Liddiard's wills out of that study. So we do have some sort of record of those wills that have since been destroyed. What I first did when I met Stuart Liddiard was, and he was a doctor, was convince him to actually take a Y-DNA study. And that was the start of the Liddiard Y-DNA study, which we now have nearly 30 reciprocants. Now, these are markers tested of 2 Liddiard from the Aldbourne lines against Strats, who was, as I said, the descendant of that Aldbourne line from 1453. We can see that was an exact match. So we knew that it was one and the same family and we both share the same ancestor. Now, where we were prior to 1453, that's a subject to debate. It could have been Gloucestershire, although the earliest record I have found from us in Wiltshire is in another little village next door to Aldbourne in Ramsbury from around 1353. Okay, so why is there 27 variants? Now, the clue to why there is 27 variants, if you look at the places that we're from, very, very small agricultural villages. Now, I have found immigration from those 2 villages was happening even in the 1500s and the 1600s. So the name was spelt very differently back then. The only one that kind of kept the same spelling was those from the Aldbourne lines, but they were very well educated and all of them could read and write. However, when we come over to Aldbourne, not so much. We'll probably be descended from probably a third, fourth, or even fifth brother of that line from Aldbourne. May not have been as well educated, and certainly as the generations went on from Aldbourne, there was not many wheels. A lot of us were agricultural labourers, so someone else was writing that name down for them. The accepted spelling also in Aldbourne from the late 1600s, certainly to the late 1700s, was actually Liddiards with a Y. Now, what I found is as time went on and we started moving out of those small agricultural villages, we actually took the spelling of the name as it was in that particular time, and we kept that through the ages. And that's why it started. We find in Somerset, it's LYD. In Gloucestershire, it's LYDDIAT. Now, if you say the name out loud, and because the many vowels and I's and A's that can be substituted from Y's and E's, example, in Australia, we actually pronounce it Liddiard. If I go back to Aldbourne, the pronunciation is Liddiard. So you can hear the different spellings. Also, too, when we moved to another country, the dialect was very, very different. So people actually wrote it down as they sounded. And those spellings have continued on. But through Y-DNA study, we find that we are really all one family, except for a few exceptions, which was mostly maternal mishaps. This is a transcription that John Diamond did from the Aldbourne Heritage Centre many, many moons ago, and it was the basis of my studies and to push the One Name Study forward. I was ever so grateful for him that he did this in the late 90s and early 2000s. But as you can see, this is taken from the late 1600s, where the name started settling down, but it certainly was LYDIARD. So what I have learned very early on, say the name out loud as you see it. If it sounds like Liddiard, more than likely it is. As I said, we're from small agricultural villages. The migration started in the early 1600s. Certainly we started moving into the bigger market towns like Hungerford, Swindon, Marlborough, and certainly Chippenham from the late 1600s. We weren't afraid to actually venture out either. The Liddiards, and they actually came from Bonham, Wiltshire, who spell their name Lydyard, which is still prevalent in the US today. They actually moved from Wiltshire to Nova Scotia in the early 1700s. I've since found the LYDs, IADs, a prominent family in America. They moved out of Wiltshire when that was the accepted spelling of the name. So as we moved out, we took the current spelling with us and we've continued that on through today. As I said, Liddiard and Liddiard from Gloucestershire, Liddiard from Aldbourne to London, and I had to use DNA to prove it was certainly the same family, and it is. We all share the same ancestor. When we got to Australia, there is some Liddiards. Obviously, they came from that line that moved to America, went to New Zealand, came to Australia from that way. The majority of the spelling in Australia is the way that my family spell it, which was LYDDIARD, except for one line. As you can see down the bottom, that was LYDD, and that was from a family that was trying to hide the convict past. He was actually from a branch of my own family, from the second or third generation, prior to having a convict, which is considered Australian royalty now. It wasn't considered quite right to have that in the family, so they slipped the I to the Y just to hide the past of the family. How do I handle so many variants in the database? I actually record what it is today and what's the accepted family. When I say that, I wait till 4 or 5 generations to see whether or not the spelling settles down. Then I note and state what it was in the original records. However, it does make for some interesting searches, and there's a lot of stars in there. I know that I've got to search for LID, LED, LYD, and the appropriate one at the end. So it does make for some interesting searches. I think the weirdest deviant I've ever seen from Ancestry was they mistranscribed Liddiard as Tiddiard. So I thought that was quite amusing. I don't know how they did that because it's clearly Liddiard in the 1850 census for that poor Joseph. So where are we today? As you can see, we span across 6 continents. There was a lot of immigration streams in and out of Wiltshire at that particular time. We came to Australia as convicts. There were 7 of us. And from then on, we started coming from 1841 as free settlers. My own family came in 1869 for the second time, 1861 by the first time. We decided it wasn't for us, went back to England, and then decided to come back to Australia after all. As I said, we started migrating to the US from Nova Scotia, Canada, from certainly the early 1700s. The Liddiards from Bronham started coming into Northern America from the early 1700s, 1720, 1730. Wiltshire had a number of immigration schemes, particularly in the between 1840s, 1880s. It wasn't doing very well as an agricultural town. There was a lot of hardship there. So there was an Wiltshire immigration scheme to Australia and Canada. The Mormon church actually had a lot of their preachers over there. So there was a couple of families that actually immigrated to Salt Lake City in Utah in the 1850s, 1860s. There's more than 300 Liddiards now in Salt Lake City and in that area today from those particular families that migrated from Aldbourne all those years ago. Researching from down under and from a locational town has not always been easy. When I first started, there was no Ancestry. It was actually going into the city. And from Lower Portland, that's about an hour and a half trip each way, so 3 hours every Saturday. I used to do that for some years to actually go in and start collecting those names. What I was doing, I didn't know was a one-name study, but I had actually collected all of the Liddiards from Wiltshire and from much help from the Wiltshire Family History Society as well, and their brilliant parish records. I also made myself known and the Liddiard Study known from all of the history tenors in and around those particular areas in Wiltshire, also the societies and the villages we came from. And I have to say I've been welcomed with open arms with my many, many, many questions through to this day. I still ask a load of questions about the history because for this study, which is obviously regional, and we are all one family at the end of the day, you need to understand the history of why did we move? Why did we move to Canada? Why did this happen? Etc. We also have a great presence online with the Guild, which I have to thank enormously, with Facebook, with Twitter, etc. I've never been afraid to write to other Liddiards and have had a 30% success rate. I've also written articles about the family to other family history societies just to get the name out there, and have done many virtual presentations to the society and history cramps, also in person when I happen to be in England. Like any family, we have the notorious, the noble, and the nutties of the family. This one was the most notorious and a very, very, very interesting example of a notorious Liddiard. When I was collecting all of the birth, deaths and marriages in Australia in the hope of stumbling across the answer to my family, you can imagine my horror when I saw this one, which is from Grafton, New South Wales in 1886, that the cause of death was dislocation by the neck by hanging. Obviously what he did. So I actually wrote to the Grafton History Society, because Trove wasn't online in those days, and asked for if they had any information. Well, there was many newspaper articles. William Liddiard actually was involved in a murder, supposedly through jealousy of his wife. However, that's not the end of the story with William. If we actually go back further, his wife, Elizabeth Bank, was actually a member of the circus family, the Bank Circus. And those that are old enough to remember one of the Sgt. Pepper song, that he actually talks about the Bank Circus member in that song as well, for the benefit of Mr. Kite. The story of William is, in early 1885, what it shows was there was a £25 reward for the identification of a man found murdered. A few months later, William and his wife were arrested, and he was charged with the murder. Elizabeth was let go. Unfortunately, I've never been able to find out what happened to Elizabeth. Obviously, she's changed her name or actually went back to the UK where she was from. If we look at the evidence, though, in today's terms, he probably never would have been convicted. It's all circumstantial, but, it was an outcry then, so they had to find somebody, and William was obviously a suspect, and there was circumstantial evidence, I must admit. Some of our noble Liddiards, we've got Private Herod Thomas Liddiard, who is actually from Gloucestershire. He actually fought in the Battle of Little Bighorn in the US. Really interesting read on here, which we've actually done a presentation, and we've actually written a blog about Private him. He actually went over there specifically to fight. So he obviously believes strongly on the Civil War front. Another noble one, I have to mention my great-great-uncle, who was actually on the Aurora boat with the Shackleton expedition to go down to Antarctica. He was a carpenter and looked after the dogs. He built many of the huts down in Antarctica today. So when I say we've actually been on all 6 continents, I can actually thank Thomas Radford Liddiard for giving us Antarctica. In the Antarctic Museum down in Tasmania, which I've been to, and they've sent me a lot of copies of the specimens. He actually collected and photographed a lot of Antarctica when he was there in the 1913s, 1911. An interesting side note on Thomas Radford was the fact that when he went to sign up after being in the British Merchant Navy, and that's how we got to Antarctica, he wasn't allowed to fight for Australia because he was actually colourblind. I thought that was quite sad. But again, when you think about it, Antarctica is white and blue, really, or white and black. So that probably wouldn't have proved a problem for him down there, but certainly wasn't. He wasn't allowed to be in World War I because of his colourblindness. Another very nutty, one of the very nutty Liddiards, which has caused many boxes and actually made a particular solicitors very rich. There are 3 or 4 boxes on this particular case in Wiltshire, the Wiltshire History Centre in Chippenham. There was Stephina Liddiard's will. Her father, William Liddiard, actually built Poulton House, and to this day you can actually see his emblem on the door and the WL on the downpipes of this house. He unfortunately only got to live in it for about 6 months prior to him passing away. He left everything, as you do, to his son, and his wife could live in the house until her death. His son then passed away prior to Elizabeth, his wife, passing away. So then she left everything, Elizabeth, the mother, to Stephina. In her will, Stephina then wrote a will, leaving everything back to her mother, Elizabeth. Elizabeth then died, then Stephina died, and then started the 150-year family court case, who was actually going to inherit Poulton House, who was originally 1,000 acres in near Minor, or Mildenhall, how we would say it, but it's pronounced Minor, in Wiltshire, just down the road from Aldbourne. So what's next for the study? We will continue to use the manorial records and parish records to find the paper records between the Aldbourne and Ogbourne family. How I actually look at it is a giant jigsaw puzzle. We've actually got the outer edges and we've got the middle. What we don't have is the link between the middle and those outer edges, and that is what I continue to actually try and find. I've promised myself in the next 12 months that I'm going to learn all about the big Y DNA and how it could help my study. I'm told that you can actually build trees out it. I'm honest, I haven't done any work on that. My first lesson will be the Australian seminar in Canberra in April, and from then I will do a lot of reading and find out how that will actually help my study. We estimate that we've got another 5,000 Liddiards invariant to find, so that will keep us busy for quite a few years yet. And I will continue to build both the TNG sites, the Guild TNG site and the Liddiard Family History Society. We're also busy planning our next 2 gatherings in 2024 and in Salt Lake City in that same year. For those that may not have heard, as a joke in 2013, I said to Aldbourne, at a meeting in Aldbourne History Centre, I think it's about time we got some Liddiards back in Aldbourne. Which they took to mean that we were actually having a Liddiard gathering. And then I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I'm actually going to have to do this now. So it took quite a few years to actually get together the first one. But in 2016, we held the first Liddiard gathering in Aldbourne, and we had 200 people come from all over the world come back to Aldbourne for that 3-day weekend, which we held many photos, and we actually had 200 meters of the trees of the Liddiard family. And it was quite interesting that 2 cousins who hadn't seen each other for 20 or 30 years actually found their family on the same time by following the tree down. It was quite a nice thing to see. Some of the manor records, quickly, I've had a look at. This one's been eaten by a giant mouse, and that came from King's College in Cambridge. This is the manor record from 1453 that mentions those 3 brothers that actually came in and rented the lands from the deans and canons of Cambridge. And we're able to find out their names and then start working our way forward. But yes, it's that mouse was rather hungry. I was a bit surprised that it was actually King's College, Cambridge, that the records were quite bad, and they've actually had those records since 1300. But I guess once they're gone, they're gone. But unfortunately, they are being preserved now. What the manor records have told us, as you can actually see, this one's from 1720 from the same area. It actually gives you the names and ages, what they held, and also to who it's actually going to be passed on to once the first leasehold actually passes away. We did not have the age of William Stratton Liddiard prior to actually looking to this, because he was actually born in Ireland and not in Wiltshire. And the parish records weren't available at that particular time. Some of the land records that are available, if you find a lease that's mentioned in a manor record, chances are there may be, fingers crossed, the actual land indenture or the lease that they actually signed. It often tells you what the relationship is, whether or not they inherited the money. Sometimes it can be from the maternal family. I have many times that it actually mentions that, Lucy Smith was the aunt of William Liddiard, etc., etc. What it also gives us is the actual signature under the official stamps there. It's lovely to have. So what do we hold at the moment? 13,204 individuals as of yesterday. We hold 2,500 marriage certificates or transcriptions from around the world. That's certificates. We're not actually counting parish records, marriages here. We have 25,000 images of records from around the world, either wills, manorial records, workhouse records, land indentures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Over 400 photographs of the family which have been given to us or donated through those many Liddiard gatherings that we've held. I do use Family Tree Maker, and the only reason I do that, I'm used to it, and I've used it from day one. I find it easy to manipulate, so that's why I'm sticking with that. We do use TNG. I've got two sites. We've got the Guild site, and we've also got the site for the Liddiard Family History, which that funds on its own. I do use Custodian just to keep a track on the records, and an Excel spreadsheet. What I do is I dump all the records as I hear about them and find them. And I actually put them down into Dropbox, which I can access either on my iPad, my laptop, or my phone when I'm in an archive centre. I've also, the column is like what the record is, where it is, have I looked at it, when I looked at it, what the image number was, is there a Liddiard, and have I transcribed it? There's 7,500 records in that database, and it also stops me actually like ordering something twice that you've already looked at. So as you can see, this study certainly is a worldwide study and always was going to be. I started from Australia when the name was in the UK. There's actually only 3 generations from my own family that it actually gets back to England, so it was always going to be a worldwide study. I can say that it's never boring. We can expect the unexpected from our family, which is always has kept it interesting over the last 30 years. Finally, those family legends, were they fact or fiction that my family told me? Always spelt our name Liddiard? Well, as you can see, no, we didn't. Millions in chancery? There's always a bit of truth in some of the myths and legends that are handed down from generation to generation. There was a case in chancery, but it wasn't a Liddiard family. However, one of the Aldbourne Liddiards married into the St. John family, or Lord Bolingbroke. They're the family that actually owned Liddiard House near Swindon in Wiltshire. It was one of their relatives that actually married the servant very quietly, left Liddiard House, and had a son. And I think the legend has come down through that. It was nearly word for what I was told. But as I said, one of the daughters actually married one of the St. Johns, Frederick St. John. So that's probably how the legend came about. We own Salisbury Plains. Well, actually, part of the Salisbury Plains was called the Liddiard Plains at one time in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. I think that's where it's actually came from. But that was actually named from Liddiard House, not actually our family. We owned Liddiard House and it was taken from us. We didn't come within any bull's roar of Liddiard House. It was actually, as I said, owned by this Indian family. We have come into contact with them in various places in history. We actually sold Rockley Manor to them. Eventually, that was Lord Bolingbroke. Other name is John St. John. Also to, I think it's just the name that we didn't, there's no way we came from. Many Lydia have said to me, you haven't gone back far enough. The St. John family is very well documented back to the 13 and 1400s, and certainly there's no mention of our family in any of that. Someone stole our family Bible. No, that was with my great aunt, and actually wasn't a family Bible. It was actually the photographic album that my earliest ancestor from England brought out. In that photograph album, I'm very, very lucky to have, is I can piece together now 6 generations of our family. It actually goes back to etchings of one Jonathan Liddiard, who was born in 1777. So for our next Liddiard gathering, I'll be able to show 6 generations of the Liddiards. So it's all pretty amazing. I hope you've enjoyed just the scratching of the surface of this and how we've put it together over the last 30 years. If you've got any questions I'd love to hear them. Thank you very much.
Wow. There's been no questions at the moment. However, I have a few. I just wanted to ask in terms of how you track things like pictures and documents. So you literally, presumably, you obviously use some sort of numbering structure, and
Yes, I
then
do.
you
Yep.
put, I don't know, you either put them in a Polly Pocket of some description, or write it in pencil, or stick a post-it note, or you do something that links you up to that document so that you can find it. Is that in custodian, or do you keep that in Excel?
That's in Excel.
Is it? Okay.
Yep. And what I do is to save copyright.
Yeah.
You certainly don't want to get into trouble. I actually transcribe those records.
Yeah.
Then what I do is I put the transcription up onto our website and I link it to the family involved, which you can do from TNG.
Yeah. So the spreadsheet that you can track so that you know what you've actually
Yep.
got, because we've all
Yep.
done it.
Yep.
I've done it this week. I was looking at something, and I was excited to find something. And it was only when I was looking for something else this afternoon, I realised I would have had that same excitement 6 years ago when I first found it. So no matter how long you've been doing this,
Yep.
you know, and I'm a bit of a filer as opposed, I'm not a filer, I'm a piler. So I confess, I have lots of bits of paper where I've got copies and I've got second copies. Yeah, we've all done it, and I confess. Um, what about the Quaker element? You mentioned about nonconformists.
Yes.
Have you been able to find the Quaker details? If you looked,
Okay, there is some in even today. Aldbourne's got a very large Methodist congregation there. The early records aren't missing, but the later records certainly are. And the only reason that we can find them is they actually went to Hungerford Meeting House, Marlborough Meeting House, those records to survive. What I also find is a lot of them actually donated land to build the meeting houses as well. So we've actually found records in the land indentures that I mentioned, and also in their wills as well. They were mentioned that. Those Nova Scotia Liddiards, a lot of them were Quakers. I think they would have moved for religious reasons.
I have Quakers that were in Surrey, but right on that border with Hampshire.
Mm-hmm.
And I have, in fact, whilst you were talking, I was actually searching for it, and did actually find it. And I will send you the images, Karen, so that you can have a look. And I have a whole load of Quaker stuff, which I've accumulated over, I don't know, 30 years. And I'll send it all to you, and then you can have a look and see if there's any Liddiards. I know there's at least one because I've just spotted it.
Okay.
And my final question to you is around South Africa. So there is a really great website. I can't remember what the site's called, but it's a TNG site that's operated, and it looks at South Africa migrants in 1820, I want to say. Have you checked? Have you had anyone that went to South Africa?
Yeah, we've actually got quite a few in South Africa. And it was quite both from Australia, believe it or not, and from the UK.
Okay.
We were involved in a lot of mining. Hamilton Liddiard from Victoria and Melbourne, he went over there through mining. A lot of them went through some of the migration schemes from the UK as well. We do have quite a few still in South Africa at the moment. Also through Rhodesia or Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
There was quite some Liddiards as well.
Okay. Fascinated. Now, we've had a question come through. Stephen, did you want to unmute yourself and then you can ask Karen yourself this question? I'm sure she'd be delighted to hear from you. So the unmute button is that, oh, it's green on my slide. And you should be able to hear. It's the second one down. So it pops out the side and you're able to talk. It's the little microphone symbol. Don't know if you can see it. It doesn't turn green. Okay. Let me mute myself.
Maybe I have to, maybe I can do it. I don't know, because I'm change presenter maybe.
Wondering if we can do it for you. Bear with us, folks. I think it'll be. Isn't it infuriating? I know we've done this before. Let's see if I can find you on the list. I've just spotted it. You'd never think I'd do these every month, would you? There you go. You're green now, Stephen. Over
Thank
to you.
you very much. Yes. Yes. So turns out that my wife is a Liddiard, so I was very interested in this webinar. We're from the U.S. and I'm a genealogist, and she's not, but I'm interested. And so she can trace her. I've helped trace her Liddiards back to Canada, to Nova Scotia, and then there's a Thomas Liddiard that emigrated from England. I have no idea where in England or where he was born, and I've got some dates behind that, 1733 to 1794. So it's and I can't get any farther on ancestry, and I've tried to find my past, and I didn't know whether you had any resources that I could avail myself of and try to take this back further.
What a coincidence. I was actually working on that family 2 weeks ago.
All right.
And I'm pretty sure that I actually have where he's from. I don't have my study open at the moment, but from the top of my head, I think he's from the north, Macclesfield. But if you want to email me, I will certainly send you what I've got.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, thank you very much.
See, wasn't it worth persevering and turning that little red button green? And I'm really glad that you found a webinar that actually was about the surname that you were interested in. So that's,
yeah, how about that? That's pretty good.
That's great. So, Stephen, obviously you've signed up with your email address. Do you have any objections if I pass that on to Karen?
No, go right ahead. Thank you.
Okay, I'll send it so that you've got details of it, and I'll make a note, and I promise not to forget. Just going to write it down. Just one more question that I had, Karen, around the colorblindness. Do you track that as you're researching and you find out that someone's colorblind? Do you keep a track? Do you kind of make a note of it so that you can see if there's a pattern to it?
I have, and there's not. So we're pretty sure that it actually came down through the maternal side on that line, none of the other males. But what we also have to keep a track on is the female side. That besides the middle name Elizabeth that all of us girls were given that are Liddiards, were born Liddiards, is the fact that we also were handed down an adverse reaction to anesthetic, every single one of us. Every single one of us. So we have to, none of us can have a day surgery because we have a bad reaction with anesthetic. So we keep a track of things like that as well through the family.
Yeah, I didn't know whether it was just me that did things like that, but I'm glad to see I'm not alone.
Yeah, no, and we've all inherited the Liddiard nose, and we've all, which is very prevalent from the etching from 1777. We've all got it, and there's sheer doggedness, but although some would call stubbornness.
I'm not going to comment. But no, I think that's great. There isn't any more questions from what I can see. So Karen, I really appreciate you getting up really early so that you could deliver the webinar for us in my evening, but your early morning, and you now have a whole day to go through before you can get to bed and catch up on some sleep. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing, and allowing us to put the spotlight on your study. And this, and the fact that we had somebody kind of listening in who actually listened and heard a connection to the study, I think is great. And if that doesn't inspire guild members to get out there and do it, I don't know what will. So I think that's absolutely great. So thank you so much. If there's any last minute questions, please pop them in the thing. Otherwise, I'm going to close off for this webinar, and we'll be back. I want to say it's the 8th, I think, and it is on the 8th of February. Actually, we've had another quick message from Sue, actually, who says, my Liddiards, with the whole variety of spellings, are from Bath. And I'm assuming you've written that I think they're Masons. Hopefully that is right.
Yep, they were. Yep. I know. I do know that line. We're actually trying. We've got that line from about 1700, really late 1690s through to today. That's part of that big jigsaw puzzle. We're trying to work out where they actually came from. And most of those lines, I think they're right. These LYD, there's a Peter Mason that married into the Fisher family. I've actually got a lot of their wills and documents and stuff that I'm happy to share if that's going to help.
Yeah, I think this is the thing, isn't it, with coming from villages and rural places, was that the marriage pool was pretty small. So when you showed that tree and you could see the crossover between various lines, and I have that on both sides of my family, both in my family from Sicily and in my family in the southeast of England. And it is just because the marriage pool is just so much smaller that you can just see. And in fact, I get quite excited if I get a different surname, one that I haven't encountered before, because otherwise it's just the same old names popping up time and time again. So it's always interesting to see that. Sue's just popped another comment in and says, my ancestor may be a legitimate line from there. And the Fisher family is also mine. I don't know, Sue, whether you know Karen. If you don't know Karen and are happy for me to pass on your email address, which I'll happily do, just pop a little note in the thing, and then I will do that after the session. Yep. So, and then you'll be able to communicate, and I think this is great. So in terms of leads from a webinar, I think this has been a really good one, because it's given us, well, it's given Karen actually a load more work to do, and that connection, and I think that that's really good. And certainly the one thing I did want to actually ask you, I remember now, was the last reunion you did.
Yep.
How many people turned up?
The 2016 or the 2016 we had over 200. 2019 we had about 150, 160. The very first one we also had BBC turn up as well. So
no, I remember you.
Yeah.
Were you aware of the BBC turning up, or did they just arrive?
I got a phone call 2 days before. John Diamond from the Aldbourne History Centre got a phone call. Jeff and I were in London at the time, and said, "Oh, the BBC are trying to get in touch with you." So they asked me for an interview over the phone. So I did not know they were going to turn up on that day. We were asked down to the Wiltshire radio studios after the event to tell them how it happened. I knew about that, but I didn't know the cameras were actually going to be there. Neither did I know that a reporter from one of the national papers were going to be there either.
Wow, how exciting is that? So when's your next one, Karen?
September 2024, we're doing one back in Aldbourne. And from there, I'm flying out to Salt Lake City, and we're actually going to do our first one in America in Salt Lake City.
Good for you. take my hat off to you, the fact that you managed to pull it all together and you're 10,000 miles away from where you're going to do it. So I think that's excellent. So Stephen and Sue, I'm going to send over your emails addresses to Karen, and who will be in touch with you, I'm sure, relatively soon. And I will make sure, and this recording will be up more than likely tomorrow, I would think, and I'll make it available if people want to follow. If you have a look on the news feed on the Guild website, it will be listed there, and it'll be a news post, and you're able to click in through to it. And we've just had another email actually just come in, just another question from Paul, who says, I can trace my Liddiards to Essex. Do you know where these would have originated from?
What's the spelling? Because that gives me a clue.
It looks, well, Paul's written it in as L-I-D-D, which I think is how you spell
Yeah.
yours, isn't it?
More than likely, it's from Wiltshire. More than likely with that spelling. If you want to email me and give me the name of the earliest one in Essex, I have got quite a few Liddiards in Essex, including some of my own that moved from Wiltshire to Essex, from Essex to London.
What were they doing for the move? What was that prompted that?
All my family were actually masons and builders, and probably the work probably just dried up. The work probably just dried up. So we moved from Aldbourne to Ramsbury late 1700s. Then we were in London by the early 1800s. We stayed there we left some there. We stayed there for 70 years. The next generation came to Australia.
And well, no matter how you get there, what a great place to be. At least the weather's better. So on that note, Paul, if you have no objections, I'm going to send across your email address to Karen so that you can communicate. If you have any objection, just pop a little note in there and I won't share it. But hopefully that you'll say yes, keep it nice and simple for me. And I've already got a really full piece of paper of my notes. And then I will, that's great, Paul. So I will send out across the emails for Stephen, Sue and Paul. And the recording will be up on the Guild website, hopefully tomorrow. So I think this has been a really great session. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. I'll be back on 8th of February with Julian Pooley. And I can't remember what it's called now, but it's a great session. So if you're intrigued by how a book can sit on a bookshelf for 20 years and be this pivotal thing that leads you into a different project, sign up and you'll hear all about it next time. So Karen, thank you so much for today. I really appreciate it. This has been a great session, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Bye
Julie.
for now.